Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Jose Fernandez Leon Felens and I welcome you to a new talk in this seminar series in Neuro Artificial Intelligence, broadcast by the Faculty of Exact Sciences of the University of Central Buenos Aires, with the support of Scientific and Technological Center CONICET Tandil, the Faculty of Health Sciences, and the Argentina Society for Neuroscience Research, together with the CIFICEN CONICET Tandil. In this occasion, the presentation will be given by Dr. Stephen Grossberg, who has been internationally acknowledged to be one of the most important pioneers and research leaders regarding how our brains make our minds. He's often called the father of artificial intelligence because he introduced the modern neural networks paradigm in 1957 as a Dartmouth College freshman, as well as being as the first to develop the neural networks model of essentially all the mind processes whereby our brain makes our conscious and unconscious minds in both healthy and individuals and clinical patients. Grossberg published his award-winning magnum opus Conscious Mind Resonance Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind in 2021 to provide a self-contained and non-technical overview and synthesis of these discoveries, and to provide theoretical explanation of the data of hundreds of psychologists and neuroscientists. It's a great honor to have a Dr. Grossberg, to whom I sincerely thank for accepting the invitation to this NeuroAI seminar series. Let's play the video now.
That in mind, my lecture today is about from designs for autonomous agents to clinical disorders, linking cortically mediated learning to Alzheimer's disease, autism, amnesia, and sleep. And it's fair to ask, how can a talk on this topic even be given? It's because the results are based on the most advanced neural models of how our brains see, recognize, and predict objects and events in a changing world, models that emerged through 50 years of research. They also offer an explanation of what goes on in each brain as it consciously sees, hears, feels, or knows something, the topic that I'll return to at the end of my talk. It's fair to ask how much progress has been made. Indeed, there's been a scientific paradigm shift that's required new design principles, new mathematics, major computer resources, and multiple experimental techniques. If we ask what is this paradigm shift, let's note it began in the late 1800s when great scientists such as Helmholtz, Maxwell, and Mach worked in both psychology and physics. It's accelerated in the 1970s, and I've summarized this history in my 1988 Neural Networks article in the first issue of that journal. Briefly, this paradigm shift is about understanding how an individual adapts on its own in real time to a complex and changing world. Otherwise expressed, it's about autonomous adaptation to a changing world filled with unexpected events. For AI, it concerns new designs for autonomous adaptive intelligence. My own work focuses on how does a brain give rise to a mind, because that links brain mechanisms to mental functions, which can then be applied to technology. To do this, we need to ask what level of brain organization controls behavior, or what is the functional unit of behavior. I think we can all agree that brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success, but then we need to ask what level of brain processing governs behavioral success. In fact, 50 years of research have shown that it's the network and system levels, which is one reason that we study neural networks. And we do so or at least my colleagues and I have done so by developing a modeling method and cycle whereby we start with scores or hundreds of parametric behavioral experiments. The art of modeling helps us to think of them as emerging from autonomous behavior of individuals in real time. It's always led to new design principles, translated into mathematical models and analyzed. It's explained a ton more behavioral data and a great deal of neural data, as well as making multiple new predictions based on the functional understanding of brain through this derivation, all the while spinning off new model designs and mechanisms to technologists who need autonomous adaptive intelligence. The core of this work leads to true theories which have just a small number of equations, as in physics, a somewhat larger number of modules or microcircuits. One could think of them as the molecules, perhaps, of the brain. And these come together in a somewhat larger number of modal architectures for different modalities of intelligence, such as vision, audition, and so on. I'll be using the predictive art or PART architecture, which clarifies how prefrontal cortex learns to control all higher order intelligence, to organize my talk. It was published in 2018. You can find it on my webpage. And here's the macro circuit for PART. It's quite a comprehensive model. But first, what principles determine how modal architectures are designed? To understand this, I needed to introduce new paradigms for brain computing, one being laminar computing, which asks, how are all neocortical circuits organized in layers? And how do laminar circuits give rise to biological intelligence? A key research goal of laminar computing is to develop a comprehensive theory of how laminar neocortical circuits are specialized for different types of intelligence. And at the moment, we do have such circuits to model 3D vision, speech, and cognition, all of them using specializations of the same canonical laminar circuitry, providing an existence proof for work that I assume will go on for many years in the future. And as this laminar theory matures, we can imagine a self-organizing VLS chipset with computationally consistent modules assembled into autonomous adaptive agents for carrying out multiple intelligent tasks. Another important paradigm that I introduced I call complementary computing, which asks what's the nature of brain specialization. Here one introduces new principles of uncertainty and complementarity that clarify why there are multiple parallel processing streams with multiple processing stages in the brain, as in this famous macrocircuit of the visual system by David Van Essen and his colleagues. If we ask what are complementary properties, we note immediately their analogies like a key fitting into a lock or puzzle pieces fitting together. Let me say in words what complementary computing means and then illustrate it with greater and greater detail. Computing one set of properties at a processing stage prevents that stage from computing a complementary set of properties. And these complementary parallel processing streams are balanced against one another. It's quite a yin and yang kind of situation, such that interactions between streams overcome their complementary weaknesses. I say this with confidence because now we know quite a few pairs of complementary processes. This is just a subset of known processes. And let me immediately turn to a very important one, the complementarity of visual boundaries and surfaces. And visual perception goes on in this part of the PART or predictive art architecture. Well, what is a visual boundary or grouping? It can be an illusory contour. It can control texture pop out. It can regulate 3D shape from texture. It can separate figures from their backgrounds. So a boundary is emphatically not just an edge. And this illusion of neon color spreading illustrates what I mean when I say visual boundaries and surface computations are complementary. I hope you can all see this bluish coloration within this square. Well, neither of them are in the image, which consists only of black and blue arcs, but this emergent property of neon color spreading illustrates both boundary completion and surface filling in. The boundaries here of the square form in an oriented fashion inwardly between pairs or greater numbers of inducers. The blue color spills out of little breaks in the boundaries where the black and blue arcs come together. I can't explain why now. And that color then spreads in an unoriented fashion throughout the emergent square. Oriented, unoriented, inward, outward. You begin to get a sense of what complementarity means. And these are going on. The boundaries in the so-called interblock stream from lateral geniculate nucleus to cortical area V4, and the surfaces in the so-called parallel blob stream in the cortex. Well, what does insensitive direction of contrast means? That has to do with the difference between seeing versus knowing, or seeing versus recognizing. For example, this Ehrenstein figure is just some blue lines facing inward, but you can both see and recognize this emergent circle due to the illusory brightening inside of it. On the other hand, if you have an offset grading, which is also induced just by blue lines, you don't really see it. It's very salient and you can recognize that it's there. So this is an invisible percept that you can consciously recognize. The offset grading shows that some boundaries are invisible or amodal, but I actually claimed many years ago that all boundaries are invisible, at least within the boundary stream. And one reason for this is to help to recognize object boundaries in front of textured backgrounds. In the reverse contrast Knizia square, you can have a black gray or dark light contrast grouping with a white gray or light dark contrast. Opposite polarities can build a boundary between them. So can like polarities. And both opposite and like polarity groupings come together in a unified square. This fact becomes, takes on a new, can be said in another way when we go around the circumference of this gray disk. Because here we have a gray black, here we have a gray white, light dark, dark light, light dark, dark light. If the boundaries were just between light and dark, there would be holes in it and color could pour out. Likewise, if the boundaries are just between dark and light. But if at every position you pool light, dark, and dark light, then you could get a boundary around the entire disk. And this happens at a very early stage in cortex, in cortical area V1. At every position, there are pairs of like-oriented simple cells of opposite contrast polarity, dark light, light dark, that add their outputs at complex cells, which are then able to respond to both polarities. So to talk about insensitivity direction of contrast means you can't tell the difference between dark light or light dark, and that's why all boundaries are invisible. But if boundaries are invisible, then how do we see? I suggest this is due to filling in of surface color such that boundaries define the compartments within which lightness and color spread. A beautiful example of this is the classical Craig-O'Brien-Korn suite effect. Looks very simple, a darker gray rectangle, a lighter gray rectangle, surrounded by a black border. However, something remarkable happens if you remove the black border, which I will do after I count to 3, and I want you to pay very careful attention to this image. 1, 2, 3. Now you can see that really the background luminance on both sides is identical. You have a more luminous and a less luminous cusp, which you can see if you don't have that bounding boundary. But if you add it on immediately, the more luminous cusp fills in here, the less luminous cusp fills in here, giving you the Craig-O'Brien-Korn suite and giving us a vivid example of the fact that boundary completion defines the filling in compartments, and filling in then determines what we see in each compartment. And so when we talk about sensitivity to direction of contrast, that has to do with the filling in of visible color and lightness, and it's a surface quality, it's a surface percept. So in '84, I was able to predict that all boundaries are invisible in the interblock cortical stream and visible quality of surface percepts in the blob cortical stream. And even today, I don't know any contradictory data. With that background, let me note this is a talk in 2 parts. And the first part is about acetylcholine neuromodulation in normal and abnormal learning and memory, vigilance control in waking, sleep, autism, amnesia, and Alzheimer's disease. It's the title of an open access article that I published in 2017 that's also on my webpage. So a unifying theme of this part of the talk is what I call vigilance control and how it can break down during various mental disorders. Most discussions of Alzheimer's disease focus on the terrible structural degeneration that occurs, but I'll explain how these structural effects can influence the dynamics of learning, recognition, and cognition during the disease, thereby providing a linking hypothesis between structure and function, including the disease symptoms. Lots of experimental evidence exists for structural events that seem to cause Alzheimer's. Notably, beta amyloid plaque and neurofibrillary tangles are implicated, and it's known that anti-amyloid antibodies can slow the disease. But how do these structural events cause the dynamics of the disease to occur? This is not surprisingly very complicated, but I'll provide you with one line of experiments and give an explanation of them, an explanation that clarifies links between Alzheimer's and disordered sleep. It's known that plaques and tangles disrupt acetylcholine functions. The plaques and neurofibrillary tangles occur primarily in cortical layers 3 and 5. The nucleus basalis of minor sends acetylcholine releasing neurons to layer 5, and cholinergic agonists produce cognitive improvements in Alzheimer's. Moreover, the alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor is highly expressed in these basal forebrain neurons. Those are neurons in the nucleus basalis. And it's known that beta amyloid peptide binds with high affinity to that receptor and inhibits release of acetylcholine, leading to acetylcholine releasing neurons with cell bodies in basal forebrain degenerating. It's known there's a profound reduction of presynaptic markers for acetylcholine neurons in Alzheimer's patients. It's also known in normal animals, anticholinergic drugs and nucleus basalis lesions disrupt learning or memory in multiple experimental paradigms. Acetylcholinesterase, ACHE, is the main enzyme to break down acetylcholine, and inhibition of it helps to ameliorate Alzheimer's symptoms. It's also known that adults above age 80 with excellent memories, so-called super ages, show much lower staining of acetylcholinesterase neurons. Moreover, an enzyme that induces acetylcholine synthesis has repairing effects on memory and behavioral disorders. So all of these facts are consistent, but how do these nucleus-based allus and acetylcholine problems affect learning, memory, and cognition? I suggest that they cause a breakdown of both tonic and phasic vigilance control, which regulate learning, recognition, and cognition. In particular, tonic vigilance sets the baseline of cortical sensitivity, and phasic vigilance changes are triggered by unexpected events that drive new learning. I can discuss this within the context of adaptive resonance theory, or ART, that I introduced in 1976 to clarify how to explain what I call the stability plasticity dilemma. This asks, how can learning continue into adulthood without causing catastrophic forgetting? And how can we learn quickly without being forced to forget just as quickly? The core circuits of ART appear here in the PART architecture. And there are a number of heuristic review articles you can find on my webpage, including the PART paper in 2018 and even more recent papers if you want to read more than I can tell you today. ART helps to solve an old problem. Why do we pay attention? Why do we learn expectations about the world? This is all about the role of top-down processing that many famous psychologists have studied using their own nomenclature. In ART, the main idea is that top-down attentive feedback encodes learned expectations that dynamically stabilize learning and memory in response to a rapidly changing world. I won't be giving you much in the way of equations today, but I want to emphasize ART works, and it's been used in many large-scale applications in technology, engineering, and technology. Check out the Tech Lab webpage at BU. One of the biggest such applications is the design of the Boeing parts design retrieval system that helped to design the Boeing 777. This is just a subset of many hundreds of applications. Well, why is ART used in so many applications? It's because it has desirable learning properties that other models do not, including deep learning. For one, ART can learn rare events. It can learn, for example, about a very rare disease outbreak that's surrounded by lots of other similar diseases. And for that, you need fast learning. It can learn large, non-stationary databases, and for that, you need self-stabilizing learning and memory. It can learn morphologically variable events, and for that, you need multiple skills of generalization, including vigilance control. And it can learn many-to-one and one-to-many relationships. Many-to-one relationships are just like when you look at all these pictures of different fruits and come out with the same predicted name, fruit. And many category learning models can do that, including deep learning. But one-to-many relationships have to do with learning expert knowledge. Here, if I look at this picture, I can say, well, that's an animal, a mammal, a pet, a dog, a Dalmatian, a fireman's mascot. That's my dog, Rover. And many models can't do that. And the challenge in particular for things like deep learning is, well, I'm learning that this image says it's a dog. I could be forced to forget my prior learning that said it's an animal. To realize these properties, ART map systems learn self-stabilizing recognition categories that solve the catastrophic forgetting problem, pay attention, thereby ignoring masses of irrelevant data to focus attention on predictive critical features, test hypotheses as part of a self-organizing production system to discover predictive constraints hidden in the data, choose the globally best answers, calibrate confidence, measuring how well a hypothesis matches the data, and all the while discovering rules and hierarchies of cognitive rules that can often be cast as if then rules. Moreover, all these properties scale. In 1988, I published an article, Neural Network's first issue, where I contrasted art versus backpropagation, showing 17 basic differences where there were problems with backpropagation that were overcome by art. This paper is also on my webpage. The third item was art doesn't need labeled data. And if you've read the interview with Jeff Hinton in Axios in 2017, you could see that he said he considers that a serious problem of deep learning. Well, ArtMap, which is the supervised version of art, was very rapidly adopted because it did really well in benchmark studies, whether machine learning, backprop, statistical methods, genetic algorithms, and so on. And that's continued to happen in very large-scale database problems like medical database and remote sensing. Here's a schematic of pioneering work of Gail Carpenter and his colleagues in remote sensing, blowing an expert system out of the water using ArtMap in learning mappings for complex remote sensing data. Gail and her colleagues went on to show how to do information fusion in remote sensing, showing how you can get multimodal integration of information from many sources, all using perhaps different descriptors, some of them incompatible, some of them incomplete, to derive consistent knowledge from inconsistent data by automatically learning and stably storing one-to-many mappings, leading finally to self-organized hierarchies of cognitive rules. Here's one simulation example showing also that you automatically get predicted confidence between these links. Well, to achieve this, there are art matching and resonance rules that help to solve the stability plasticity dilemma. Let me first state them with words. So there's bottom-up activation from the outside world into the brain. Often by itself, it can activate learned categories, other things being equal. From deeper in the brain toward the periphery, there are top-down learned expectations that have at least three properties that I'll again first state in words. They can learn prototypes that select consistent bottom-up signals to start hypothesis testing, while suppressing inconsistent bottom-up signals to start focusing attention on predictive critical features, but cannot by themselves fully activate target cells. They can sensitize, modulate, or prime them to get the system ready to more efficiently and rapidly respond if compatible data come in the future. And this is the kind of setup you have here, just two levels. It can be a multi-level system, as part illustrates. On this level, you have a distributed feature pattern. It sends one-to-many paths to the next level. Each of these paths is multiplied by an adaptive weight or long-term memory trace. You add up all these inputs to a target cell. There's contrast-enhancing competition that chooses a few of the cells or one population that has the largest input. Then though that cell or cells read out top-down signals whereby you learn a top-down learned expectation. So the kind of situation you have, if all you have is a bottom-up distributed feature pattern, and this is an active feature and this is a much less one, and if now you meet it with the readout from a learned category of a learned top-down expectation, even if this bottom-up feature is huge, if it has zero or very weak top-down weight, it's going to be suppressed as attention is focused on a subset of predictive features that are gain amplified and synchronized. Well, why are learned top-down expectations and attention needed to solve the stability plasticity dilemma? We can understand this by going back to competitive learning and self-organizing maps that I introduced with von der Malsberg in the 70s before Cahonen adapted and popularized them in his books in the 80s. Again, you have a distributed feature pattern, adaptive filter, you choose a category, but in competitive learning, the chosen category triggers learning in abutting adaptive weights of the pattern of signals coming up through these pathways, thereby tuning this filter to respond more vigorously to familiar patterns in the future. And at that time, I proved a theorem called the stable sparse learning theorem that shows you often get really good properties with competitive learning. In particular, if a sequence of feature patterns does not form too many clusters relative to the number of category coding cells, then learning is terrific. It's stable, self-normalizing, tracks input statistics, it even has Bayesian properties. But in general, I showed by example that learning is unstable in response to a dense series of inputs whose statistics do change through time, and you can easily get catastrophic forgetting. Art was introduced to dynamically stabilize recognition learning using top-down expectations and attention. And the question is, how? And the art matching rule for object attention stabilizes learning using a top-down modulatory on-center off-surround network. What that looks like is the following. Let's say you just have bottom-up features, pathways activating their target cells. Fine. Let's say you activate a category, it tries to read out. It's learned prototype through excitatory pathways. Well, it can't do so fully because that excitatory input is balanced by a broader inhibitory surround. Well, now what happens if the bottom-up input and the top-down expectation are simultaneously on? Then within the prototype, if you have bottom-up inputs too, it's two excitatory against one inhibitory, and you can start to select, gain, amplify, and synchronize features in that attentional focus. But outside the prototype, it's one against one, and you suppress these. And I've gone on in 99 already. I could say how this happens in laminar cortical circuits with identified cells, in particular coming from layer 6 of a higher cortical area. You send signals to layer 6 of a lower area, and then these signals are folded back to layer 4, where you have a modulatory on-center driving off surround. So attention acts by a kind of folded feedback. There's enormous support for these art predictions. Let me just mention two of many kinds of data. It's known that attention has an on-center off-surround characteristic. It's known that attention can facilitate match bottom-up signals, and so on. But let me turn immediately then to how adaptive resonance gets in the story. Attended feature clusters reactivate their bottom-up pathways. Activated categories reactivate their top-down pathways, closing an excitatory feedback loop between features and categories, leading to a feature category resonance that synchronizes, amplifies, and prolongs the activity of the resonating cells, thereby triggering learning in the bottom-up adaptive filters and the top-down expectations. That's why we call it adaptive resonance. And by suppressing these outliers outside the attentional focus, we solve the catastrophic forgetting problem. I'm happy to be able to say that all the key art predictions have behavioral and neurobiological support. I mainly want to just emphasize that all conscious states are resonant states, which means that resonant states in neural models match parametric properties of psychological data about conscious percepts. I so far know no contradictory data to that major claim. Well, for art to work properly, it needs to balance between expected and unexpected events, and for that we need another pair of complementary systems called the attentional and orienting system. The attentional system deals with expected and familiar events. This is where processes like resonance, attention, learning, and recognition occur, and it's embodied in brain regions like temporal and prefrontal cortex. The orienting system deals with novelty, with unexpected and unfamiliar events. Here, processes like reset, memory search, and hypothesis testing occur, including brain regions like the hippocampal system and nonspecific thalamus. Here's the ART1 model that Gail Carpenter and I proposed over 30 years ago. This is the schematic of its attentional system and its orienting system. Let me use it to sketch the art hypothesis testing and learning cycle. Here, one pathway really means a whole network of bottom-up excitatory pathways. It's drawn this way for simplicity. Suppose an input pattern turns on a distributed pattern of feature detectors. Each of these active lines tries to activate the orienting system, but the number of features here, each of them inhibits the orienting system, and there's a dynamic balance between excitation and inhibition to keep the orienting system quiet while the pattern goes to the adaptive filter and chooses a category. The category then rapidly reads out a learned top-down expectation that obeys the art matching rule and therefore might inhibit a certain number of features if the match isn't perfect. And that reduces the amount of inhibition, keeping the orienting system quiet. And the question is, when will the orienting system fire because of that reduction? And this has to do with how vigilance is chosen. It determines how big a mismatch causes reset. If indeed the orienting system gets activated, so reset occurs, this happens by a burst of non-specific arousal that activates all cells here, but the way the system is designed, the active category shuts down and stays off for a while, and thereby shuts off its top-down expectation, unmasking the original input pattern, which can now go through the adaptive filter again. And because this network is conditioned on the disconfirmation of this hypothesis, a new hypothesis can be chosen, and the cycle continues. So there's a dynamic cycle of resonance and reset that goes on until search leads to a good enough match with a known category, which can often occur with one cycle, or discovers an uncommitted set of cells and begins learning of a new category. And as categories are learned, it's a proven theorem that search automatically disengages and you get direct access to the globally mismatching category. My paper with Gail Carpenter in '87 proves these things, and they have a lot of evidence to support them. Some of that evidence comes from event-related potentials, like sequences of P120 and 200 P300s that behave like mismatch arousal and short-term memory reset during art search. Neurophysiological data, like early data from Bob Desimont's lab, showing active matching, that's reset between trials and infratemporal cortex, where categories are learned. Data from other labs showing that novelty potentials in the hippocampus subside as learning proceeds as you go toward consolidation and direct access. And more recent data with multi-electrode studies by Earl Miller and his colleagues were recording both in prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, showing rapid object associative learning may occur in prefrontal cortex. That's like our category learning, while hippocampus may guide neocortical plasticity by signaling success or failure. That's like the orienting system. So now we need to ask a little more. We need to ask, how do we determine how general our knowledge is? Well, let me claim that if there's high vigilance, you can get narrow and concrete categories, like a category that can selectively respond to a frontal view of your mom's face. But if you have low vigilance, you can get broad and abstract categories that will respond to every face. So how is vigilance controlled? And what is vigilance? Well, actually, there's more data about vigilance control in frontal cortex. Again, an early paper from Desimont's lab, who did easy versus difficult discriminations in monkeys. And I quote them, in the difficult condition, there was enhancement of the responses and sharpened selectivity for attended stimuli, just what you'd expect from higher vigilance. Well, how do you compute vigilance? Well, let's say the input pattern that activates the features X is I. When the branch that I activates tries to activate the orienting system, it's multiplied by a parameter rho. That's a gain parameter. That's the vigilance. So the total excitatory input to the orienting system minus the inhibitory input is the net activation of the inhibitory system. If it's negative, then the orienting system stays quiet and the whole system can resonate and learn. But if it's positive, then the orienting system gets activated and you get reset and search. Well, given that's the case, how do you minimize predictive error during learning a database and maximize category generalization while you're doing incremental fast learning of that database? One way to do this is by match tracking, which realizes a kind of minimax learning. Let me read this to you and then explain it. Given a predictive error, vigilance increases just enough to increase search and thus sacrifice the minimum generalization to correct the error. Remember, low vigilance gives you general categories. Higher vigilance, more concrete ones. So let's say that this ArtMap system made a prediction. To do that, the analog match between bottom-up and top-down inputs had to be bigger than the vigilance at that moment. But now let's say that prediction leads to a mismatch with a known answer. That triggers a match tracking signal which bumps vigilance to be just above the analog match, thereby giving up the minimum amount of generalization in order to drive a search for a better matching category and new category. Given all this, are ART mechanisms realized within lamina cortical and thalamic circuits? And the answer is yes, as shown by the synchronous matching ART or SMART model that I developed with my PhD student, Max Versace. Versace and I were also able to do this analysis in a network with spiking neurons and lamina cortical circuits interacting with specific and non-specific thalamic nuclei. Here's a schematic of the anatomy of it. You can see all the cortical layers, the multiple cortical levels, specific and non-specific thalamic nuclei. This kind of model explains functionally a ton of anatomical data about cortex and thalamus and their interactions. One of the things Versace and I showed, and we weren't expecting it, was if you have a good enough top-down match, the system goes in a synchronized, faster gamma oscillations, but if you have a bad enough mismatch, then it goes in a slower beta oscillation. This was a prediction, and I'm delighted to say that now several labs have shown this happens in cortical areas V1 and V4, as well as in hippocampus, thereby suggesting this kind of art dynamics is ubiquitous in multiple cortical areas. As to vigilance control, we can now see that it's due to mismatch-mediated acetylcholine release. If there's a big enough mismatch, that activates non-specific thalamic nucleus, which in turn activates nucleus basalis minor, which releases acetylcholine in layer 5, which reduces after hyperpolarization currents, which leads to an increment in vigilance and therefore sharper categories. Well, if acetylcholine dynamics collapse, therefore, we can now see new category learning is undermined, cortical layers can't resonate to recognize incoming information, and in the limit, you lose consciousness, thereby clarifying the terrible fate of many Alzheimer's patients. Well, what does vigilance have to do with sleep? Awake states are accompanied by an increased release of acetylcholine. Non-REM sleep has a cortical origin. Moreover, stimulation of the nucleus basalis elicits EEG activation and behavioral arousal, and loss of basal forebrain acetylcholine neurons contributes to sleep disruption and cognitive deficits. It's known there are up and down states during slow wave sleep, and remarkably, all cells, both excitatory and inhibitory, shut off during the down state, and layer 5 cells in the cortex initiate this activity cycle. Well, how are up and down states caused? I was delighted to realize it was already part of the laminar cortical model, which thereby helps to bridge both waking and sleep data. Here's the piece of the model that matters. Acetylcholine come into layer 5, goes through layer 6 to activate briefly layer 4 cells, followed by activation of inhibitory inner neurons, and then due to balanced excitation inhibition and contrast normalization, these inhibitory inner neurons shut off all cells, excitatory and inhibitory, simultaneously. So this explanation relates sleep disorders and Alzheimer's to problems with acetylcholine-mediated vigilance control in layer 5. The same thing, it turns out, happens in autism. Moreover, we can now see that, sadly, there's a vicious cycle. It's known that beta amyloid peptide concentration increases due to sleep deprivation, leading to more plaque formation. And more plaques in layer 5 can disrupt acetylcholine-mediated up and down sleep states, thereby further disrupting sleep. What I've just told you shed some functional and mechanistic light on this tragic, vicious cycle. Well, what does vigilance have to do with autism? I predicted that tonic vigilance can get stuck at high levels in some autistic individuals, leading to hyperconcrete categorization and recognition and a narrow focus of attention. This is summarized with my colleague Don Seidman in a Psych Review article. Then somewhat later, there was supportive psychophysical data from high-functioning autistic individuals in a couple of studies. And moreover, it's known that neuron pathology, morphological abnormalities and abnormalities of acetylcholine dynamics, both in cerebral cortex and nucleus basalis, occur in autistic individuals. I should emphasize that what I'm talking about here in autism is just one problem in autism. It's a multiple gene problem, and the model that I've developed with Don Seidman and my student Devi Kishan discusses how all these brain regions get afflicted. So now let's go into the second part of the talk. And this is about how do we consciously see, and how does a breakdown in this process lead to yet another clinical problem, one of visual neglect. And this is discussed in my 2017 paper on the hard problem of consciousness. It's on my webpage, and it's also published open access. Very briefly, what is the hard problem of consciousness? Wikipedia says it's the problem of explaining how and why we have qualia or phenomenal experiences. David Chalmers says the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there's also a subjective aspect. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy goes on to say the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why any physical state is conscious rather than unconscious. It's the problem of explaining why conscious mental states light up and directly appear to the subject, and we can still meaningfully ask the question, why is it conscious? Before jumping in, it's fair to ask, what kind of event occurs in the brain that's anything more than a whir of information processing? And what happens when conscious mental states light up and directly appear to a subject? As I've spent the first part of my talk indicating, our brains sometimes go into a context-sensitive resonance state that can involve multiple brain regions, and also claim that all conscious states are resonance states. Not all brain dynamics are resonant, so consciousness is not just a whir of information processing. And I don't have to explain for you again what is a resonance state. Instead, I can go to the central claim of this part of talk, that conscious states are part of larger adaptive behavioral capabilities that help us to adapt to a changing world. Their resonances for conscious seeing help to ensure effective reaching. Hearing help to ensure effective communication, speaking. And feeling help to ensure effective goal-oriented action. I'll just say a little bit about how conscious seeing helps to ensure effective reaching. And to start, let me ask, why did evolution invent consciousness? Well, it has to do with the fact that visual inputs to the retina are ambiguous, noisy, and incomplete. If you look at a cross-section of the eye and you look at the photosensitive retina, all these light-activated neurons have their axons bundled together to go into the optic nerve and up to the brain. And if you look down now on this part of the retina, what you see is the fovea, which is the part of the retina that is most sensitive to visual cues, is over here. And the optic nerve, where all those neurons get bundled together, is right where there's a blind spot, which is blind due to the geometry of forming the optic nerve. And the blind spot where you're blind here is as big as the whole fovea. And coming out of this region, there are many nourishing veins that also cover photodetectors. So if you even think about how do you see a blue line, it might be occluded by the blind spot and multiple retinal veins. Well, how could you reach to a line here when it isn't even registered by your brain? So multiple processing stages need to generate a sufficiently complete and stable surface representation that can control effective looking and reaching. We've already seen that we need this hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. But first we need to get rid of a percept of the blind spot and retinal veins. And this happens because our eyes are very rapidly jiggling in their orbit. We're not aware of it. And the line in the outside world is jiggling a little bit with respect to the position of the retina and thereby creates transient signals that refresh it and refresh it. But the blind spot and the retinal veins are stabilized on the retina, and stabilized images fade. So they're fading, but that still leaves a disconnected object. And in order to actually recognize and see it, we need the kind of boundary completion and grouping and surface filling in that I described for you at the beginning of the talk. So that in all these regions here where you've completed the line, it's really an illusion. It was created upstairs. It's not from the world. But we don't call it illusion. What we call an illusion is when you have an unexpected combination of boundary completion and surface filling in. So this surface representation is predicted to occur in cortical area V4. And I suggest that a surface shroud resonance between V4 and the posterior parietal cortex, or PPC, lights up the V4 surface representation with an extra degree of freedom called conscious, that's our conscious awareness, so that you're going to use this completed representation, not all the earlier garbage, to control looking at and reaching to unoccluded surface regions. And why do we need all of these processing stages? Because of complementary computing and hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. And once the surface shroud resonance forms, it can propagate top-down to the lower areas where you have less complete representations and use the arc matching rule to select only consistent data throughout the whole cortical hierarchy. So now let's come back to the fact that all conscious states are resonant states, visible qualia of surface percepts. And if we ask what kind of resonance supports visible surface qualia, we can now say a surface shroud resonance. We see because of a surface shroud resonance. So surface shroud resonances support conscious seeing, but feature category resonances support conscious recognition or knowing. Well, what is a surface shroud resonance? It's surface fitting spatial attention. It's called an attentional shroud. It's been studied by a lot of people in psychophysics, but I had predicted that shrouds enable learning of invariant object categories, something I can't tell you today, but if you're interested, look at these papers on my webpage. So how does a shroud form? Well, let's say we're looking at a cross-sectional area of an image. This is a more luminous bar, and this is a less luminous bar in cross-section. They generate topographic excitatory inputs to parietal cortex. They all compete, and they generate top-down excitatory feedback, closing an excitatory feedback loop to create a recurrent on-center off-surround network that triggers a surface shroud resonance and contrast enhance the more active region to create a shroud. So a surface shroud resonance also enhances the amount of contrast to the intended surface, which is known psychophysically and neurophysiologically. So an active surface shroud resonance means that sustained spatial attention is focused on the object surface. It also supports conscious seeing. And if you ask, why should you believe it? Well, there's a ton of psychophysical evidence consistent with it, and a lot of cortical physiological data consistent with it. So finally, I want to end by trying to explain some clinical data about consciousness using surface shroud resonances, namely parietal visual neglect. Well, if you cut part of the parietal cortex, you eliminate the surface shroud resonance, so you're not going to be conscious of that part of the surface. You're not going to address it. You're not going to name it. But there's a classical review of effects of lesions in inferior parietal lobule, or IPL, due to Driver and Mattingly, that really teaches us a lot more. And we can explain all this now. So head-centered shroud coexists with retinotopic surface qualia is shown by how neglect varies with the patient's direction of gaze. Competition for spatial attention across parietal cortex is shown by how neglect varies with isolated versus simultaneous cues. Preserved figure ground segmentation during neglect is shown by how grouping can overcome neglect. Unconscious processing of neglected object identity, the difference between seeing versus knowing, is shown by implicit knowledge of neglected stimuli. We have a seeing surface shroud resonance into the where stream. We have a knowing feature category resonance into the what stream. When they're synchronized, we can know what it is that we're looking at. There's a link between visual neglect also and motor planning deficits. This is the issue of seeing to read, shown by abnormal motor biases. Moreover, it's known that IPL lesions lead to deficits in sustained visual attention because there's no surface shroud resonance to maintain attention. And finally, if you cut the feature category resonance, you get visual agnosia, which is reaching without knowing. And this dramatizes two roles of parietal cortex, top-down spatial attention and bottom-up intention to reach. So my talk has tried to illustrate the key role of brain resonances as conscious seeing and recognition, notably of adaptive resonance theory, hypothesis testing, and category learning circuits and llama cortical circuits. And I've shown you some of the unrivaled range of clinical data that you can explain in this way. So in summary, thanks very much for listening to my talk. I feel honored to have had the opportunity to present it to you, especially during these troubled times.
Good. Many questions after listening your talk. So one of the questions is, given your hypothesis that conscious experience emerges from resonance states across modality-specific networks, is there a unifying resonance architecture that governs all forms of conscious experience, and how could this architecture be formalized computationally?
Well, in a talk like this, I only show pictures and I try to avoid rigorous mathematics and computer simulations just because I like people to know what some of the results are and what the issues are. And it's the kind of thing you have to go home and study. It's, take any theory in theoretical physics, you hear a new theory being stated, like used to happen at Los Alamos, and Wolfgang Pauli said, "Oh, those results are crazy, but they're not crazy enough." In other words, new work has always required people to learn new things, often that are very uncomfortable for them to learn, including quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, including Newton's laws. When they came out, they were considered revolutionary. There was a theory of vortices due to Descartes. So in my work, if you look at the models on my webpage, just Google Stephen Grossberg, you'll find my webpage at Boston University. You'll find a number of articles that quantitatively simulate different kinds of resonances. And so far, anyway, I and my collaborators have defined and characterized main properties of 6 main kinds of resonances. And why are they different? Because they support different kinds of conscious awareness that carry out different behavioral functions in different parts of our brains. You can measure them in different parts of the brain. So, I mentioned the surface shroud resonance, which helps us to consciously see a visual object or scene. I mentioned a feature category resonance, which helps us to recognize a visual object or scene, and I showed differences between seeing and recognizing. There are also stream shroud resonances, analogous to the surface shroud resonances, about how we consciously hear auditory objects or streams. There are also what I like to call spectral pitch and timbre resonances, whereby how we recognize auditory objects or streams, which if you look at my webpage, I had a paper in, I think, 2022 about how we can learn and consciously experience musical lyrics and melodies with variable rhythms and beats that builds on this kind of discovery. So, this is part of what I like to call the gift that keeps on giving. I could never have made even that small contribution to modeling aspects of music if I didn't have this foundation. Then in a more cognitive setting, there are item list resonances, whereby we recognize speech and language. They don't have their own qualia. And then there are the cognitive emotional resonances, whereby we link emotions that we feel with the sources that we know about that are causing the emotions. And this is very closely related to how we achieve a concept of what causes what, which is relevant to the critical feature patterns I mentioned in passing, which can be selected by contributions both of perceptual and cognitive and emotional factors. So is that a good start to that?
Yeah, fantastic. Yep, I really like the answer.
Thank you.
Good.
It only took
And
me 50 years to be able to say it. You know, it reminds me, to be a little facetious. You know, I would often give lectures to my students or talks at conferences, and I was so pleased when people came up and said, "Oh, that seems so clear, so obvious." And then with my students, I like doing the following. I used to stop before I explained some data, and I said, "So what's the explanation?" And that was followed by deadly silence. And then I said the explanation that I felt was true. Of course, all explanations in science are incomplete. And then they'd say, "Sure, sure, sure." But the word stuck in their throat because a moment before they didn't
yeah.
follow through. So a key point is that one of the hardest things to do is to develop a deep enough experimental intuition
Mhm.
that you know what questions to ask. What problem are we trying to solve? You know, coming up with the concept of adaptive resonance took me many years of earlier studies. Um, anyway, yeah, so I'll stop there for this question.
Yeah, based on what you are saying, it seems like all conscious states are resonant, but not the other way around, correct?
Um, that is correct. So all conscious states are resonant states, but it's not the case that all resonant states are conscious states. And adaptive resonances that are unconscious typically don't have readily available names from day-to-day language. And that's because they don't include, as part of a multi-level resonance, feature detectors that are activated by external senses, such as those that support vision or audition. So when you consciously see a, a visual surface, it's part of a surface shroud resonance that can feed back all the way down to V1, even to the lateral
Mm.
geniculate, and light up the consistent visual features that you're going to include in your surface representation. And also there can be internal senses, those that support emotion, like if you have a cognitive emotional resonance that's going to activate amygdala and hypothalamus as part of the resonance. And so, uh, and you know, I go into some detail in that in my magnum opus from 2021, Conscious Mind Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind, that is published by Oxford, but you can get, it's a big book. It's self-contained and non-technical, but it tries to give an exposition for a general reader of, you know, research spanning decades, including explanations of the data of hundreds of experiments. And, you know, even as hard as you can try to make it self-contained and non-technical, it's describing this And this is one of the, if not the hardest system that humans can try to understand scientifically. So you can't just read it like, Jane Austen novel. You have to read it and think about and read it and think about it, and then reread it and think about it some more. It's, if you're going to really probe this, the answers are motivated with simple ideas and beautiful to me ideas, but keep in mind that it's interactive or emergent properties that map onto observable behaviors, which is what we know from our daily experience. And being able to think about emergent properties isn't easy. And for that, you really need mathematics and computer simulations, because if you don't have that, it's just speculation. And, it's your word against my word. But if you have a rigorous methodology, and thank God computers got more and more powerful as our theories got deeper and deeper, because we were always on the edge of the available computing power, at least to a university computer system. But then in addition, um, uh, in answering this, we were talking about why some resonances aren't conscious and they don't have links to external or internal feature detectors. An important example of that is what I call a parietal prefrontal resonance. And that's crucial for opening up basal ganglia gates. Now, I don't know how many of you have studied the basal ganglia. I've always considered it an acquired taste because it's gating everything. It's gating perception, cognition, emotion, action. And to really understand its behavioral significance, you first have to understand what it's gating. So I had to model for decades with very gifted students and postdocs, aspects of perception, cognition, emotion, and action before I could begin to understand how the gates enabled or inhibited those processes. So parietal prefrontal resonances trigger the selective opening of basal ganglia gates in a context-sensitive way, because the prefrontal cortex maps into the basal ganglia using all that higher order knowledge as briefly sketched in the predictive arc model. And so it can read out the appropriate thoughts and actions. And many people know of its terrible effects when they're not gating properly, when you have Parkinson's disease. But many people are not quite as aware of how it can gate perception, cognition, etc. And we at our own family became aware of it when someone dear to us developed Parkinson's disease that involved not only their ability to walk, but their ability to think. Um, and so basal ganglia gates are what we often think of as volitional control, a go signal when we want to do something. And when they break down, you can't do what you want to do when you want to do it in the right context. Your frontal modulation doesn't do any good if the basal ganglia themselves are damaged or improperly aroused. And then there's another very important class of resonances that aren't attached to external or internal qualia. And those are the entorhinal hippocampal resonances. If you've studied spatial navigation, you might know about entorhinal grid cells and hippocampal place cells. for which John O'Keefe got a Nobel Prize, and the Moses got a Nobel Prize for characterizing them physiologically, but they dynamically stabilize the learning of entorhinal grid cells and hippocampal play cells during spatial navigation. And in fact, if you look at my book and some of my earlier papers, we show that their ability to dynamically stabilize these is because they're part of an art system for spatial category learning. Well, that's the prediction, and we've explained a lot with it. But all of these resonances, both the conscious and unconscious one, do help to solve the stability plasticity dilemma. In other words, how we get fast learning without catastrophic forgetting. But then you can have brain dynamics that don't include any possibility of resonance. That's why I like saying, don't get the wrong idea. Resonance, adaptive resonance, isn't the theory of everything, okay? Because during the activation of spatial and motor representations, they don't resonate because they obey computationally complementary laws. In other words, we don't want to solve the stability plasticity dilemma in the motor and spatial representation system. Remember, the stability plasticity dilemma wants to dynamically stabilize learned categories, whether perceptual or cognitive, and then allow them to be pruned and otherwise modestly refined while being dynamically stabilized. And if something that's too novel to do that happens, when novelty is defined by the vigilance, you'll create a new category because you have a very different kind of information you're trying to categorize. But we don't want to do that with our bodies. When we have a tiny little baby body, we are going to have matching and learning laws that we want to be flexible enough to adapt to our changing body through time, including we become big adults and some of us become great athletes or dancers. And, you know, our motor and spatial systems are continually retuning themselves to enable us to effectively act on the world. So we have a dynamically self-stabilizing perceptual and cognitive system, which gives us the substrate to control a labile spatial and motor system. And in particular in art, you have excitatory matching. That's what the art matching rule is. And learning when you have a good enough match. So it's match learning. But in the motor system, you have inhibitory matching and mismatch learning, which I explain in various papers and is summarized in my book. So excitatory matching versus inhibitory matching, match learning versus mismatch learning, the perceptual, cognitive, and spatial motor systems are computationally complementary. So in fact, our whole brain is organized into a cascade of multiple scale symmetry breaking operations during development that lead to complementary subsystems. And one of the things I will never understand, I'll be dead before it's understood, but which I encourage young people to study. I'm not trying to say this is all known. This gives, I think, a pretty secure foundation for further study for another generation at least, is how is this cascade of symmetry breaking operations during morphogenesis or development, how does it lead to computationally complementary systems. And, this asked in this generality, it leads to interesting speculations, because remember, the genetic code, the double helix, has a complementary structure. Well, is that an example of this universal developmental code? In fact, in 1978, I have a paper called Communication, Memory, and Development, where I suggest that all cellular systems, not just brains, in all species, share certain basic dynamical principles, including resonance. And you can view, to give you an example, you can view the process during development of going from a gastrula to a blastula as a version of an adaptive resonance, which is, sounds wild, but that too, this whole species-wide and phylogenetic-wide analysis of how these principles got adapted and specialized for many, many species and functions is wide open to young people or, active scientists. It won't be easy. None of this has been easy. I spent 68 years doing it, and I just finished a paper yesterday, so I'm not done.
Good, great. Perhaps Dr. Acosta is connected here. I want to ask something. In that case, please interrupt us, and raise your hand. Yeah. Otherwise, I keep going asking questions.
Oh,
Yep.
well, I think you wanted to ask me something. I wrote down one of the questions you might ask me.
Yep.
If consciousness arises from resonant states that synchronize bottom-up sensory inputs with top-down learned expectations, does this imply that all conscious perception is necessarily predictive? Maybe I can take a moment.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Because I thought that was an excellent question. So I think the answer is yes, in at least two senses. First, when you activate a category and read out a learned top-down expectation that I would claim obeys the art matching rule, which has been, I should say, that prediction has been supported in multiple species, including bats. And I could tell you more about that if you want to know. I think it's an evolutionary invariant after a certain point. So that top-down expectation only primes the target cells. It sensitizes them to input patterns that are expected and may or may not occur. So priming is a form of predictive prediction in resonance. But there's another sense which is deeper. And as I mentioned, adaptive resonance learns to select and pay attention to what I call the critical feature patterns. And these are the features that are used to predict successful outcomes. And the way in which they're embodied in our learning is because it's the critical features that are learned in the adaptive weights of our bottom-up adaptive filters and our top-down learned expectations. So not only are we focusing attention on the subset of critical features that assure predictive success and suppress irrelevant outlier features in any given context, thereby solving the catastrophic forgetting problem, but we then embody the critical features in the learning of the bottom-up filters that activate categories and the top-down expectations that prime and resonate with distributed feature patterns. So I think that Yeah, yeah. And one of the students, Gail Carpenter, and I had, I think it was Joseph asked for, he worked with us to develop what he called fusion art map. And if you look at my webpage at BU, it's just sites, sites.bu.edu/Steve G, one word, Steve G. And search for Fusion Art Map. His last name's Asfour, Asfour. Fusion Art Map just went to the limit. It said, let's say you have arbitrarily large input vectors, could be 1 billion features, in an arbitrarily long finite database. And you're going to be in very different situations. What Fusion Art Map shows is how you can extend the art analysis to being able to select in each different problem the subset of features that are critical and predictive, and learn about them for those categories that'll learn to deal with that problem. And you could have thousands or millions of categories, depending on how big your simulation is, living side by side, ready to deal with widely different environments, which of course blows models like backpropagation and deep learning out of the water. They don't even live in the same universe. And, people would say, oh, but, backprop and deep learning have been useful. And I say, yes, and I'm glad of it, but one has to know the following. There are many problems that I like to call model independent, meaning that any reasonable model can cope with them. Although with deep learning, you can have hundreds or thousands of slow learning trials, and it'll have catastrophic forgetting, and it's not explainable in a lot of problems. But, in an offline setting with a predictable stationary environment, you can get it to do decent predictions. Like if you train it slowly for weeks or months using a big bank of uber fast servers on millions of cats, and you put in an image of a cat, out'll come the prediction cat, and you'd say, oh, wow, that's wonderful. Except Gail Carpenter and I in 87 and 88, with Art 1 and Art 2, et cetera, we showed how you could learn an arbitrarily large complex database with fast learning on a single learning trial without catastrophic forgetting. And the categories would be explainable because they would learn to discover the critical feature patterns and learn about them. That was long-winded, but I'm a time-filling organism, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and then this open up question about what would be a definitive a signature of conscious resonance looks like.
What do you mean by a signature? I don't know.
Let's say what's going to be a feature about the neural signature of conscious versus unconscious resonance.
For example, gamma oscillations very
Okay.
often. So for example, like in my work with Max Versace in the SMART model of 2008, that is a model that uses spiking neurons with all sorts of foundational neurophysiological properties in identified lamina neocortical circuits. And we showed that if you get a good enough art match, you get category learning, everything synchronizes, but it realizes as a synchronous gamma oscillations. And keep in mind that if you have fast inhibitory in neurons, you can converge to a steady state. And then if you slow up the inhibitory in neurons, you can get a bifurcation, like a Hopf bifurcation, and it'll trigger an oscillatory gamma oscillation, for example. And way back in the 70s with my student Sam Elias, we studied Hopf bifurcations with this in mind. But then, so if you have a good enough match, Max and I showed how gamma oscillations could not only focus attention, but also trigger category learning. And there have been a number of physiological studies, notably from Bob Desimone's lab. He's been a wonderful leader in the field, but others too. I think Earl Miller might have some related studies compatible with that. But then Max and I also showed something that wasn't well known, and that is if you get a bad enough mismatch, you'll get slow beta oscillations during mismatch reset. And within the years after that, the decade after that, at least 4 different labs showed this kind of mismatch reset in visual cortical areas V1 and V4 and in the hippocampus. And so there's this complementarity between good enough match, give you resonance, sufficiently bad match, giving you reset, translated into gamma oscillations versus beta oscillations. Now, beta oscillations and gamma oscillations, as with all these oscillatory dynamics, might have somewhat different functional roles in different parts of the brain. Just the speed of an oscillation isn't going to tell you enough. You really have to immerse it into the brain system and what its function is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the case of category learning, gamma and beta oscillations seem to be supported, or prediction seems to have been supported by at least 4 labs in 3 brain regions. I haven't kept track over all the years because I keep moving on while I can.
Good, good. Gerardo, perhaps you have a question?
Yes, most of all, I want to, on behalf of our research institute, I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Grossberg for his talk and for sharing with us his huge knowledge about the brain and trying to explain how the brain works. Something that he was doing all along his life, and with a very great generosity, he shared it with us. And my working area is mainly in robotics. I am like a thief that stole the ideas that people like you or like Jose give to us, bring to us to develop intelligent autonomous systems. And I was wondering, in your opinion, how far we are from the knowledge that we have right now to achieve, to implement a conscious autonomous system?
Let me just write myself a reminder here. So my colleagues and I have been interested in robotics, implementations of our models for decades. Many years ago, there was a group in Spain, I forget who they are, but they were using some of our models to design, grasping. And then at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, I was invited to give, by the director of the lab, to give a year of lectures to everyone in the lab, and it was recorded and then played to all the groups in the lab, and some of them started designing approximations to humanoid robots, but now, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and then, I don't know if you know who Carver Mead is. Carver Mead introduced VLSI, and Federico Fagin, who was equally important. They got very interested in the work, and they tried to start emulating it in VLSI, which is extremely difficult. But one of the points I want to make about lamina computing, which is related to robotics, is that the lamina circuitry illustrated by the picture I put up of the smart model with Versace, that is a canonical lamina circuit. You find variations of those layers in all perceptual and cognitive and planning cortex. So one of the great challenges of robotics, if you really want to have a robot that you're not teleoperating, is to put it all in VLSI, because they're all circuits that are variations on the same canonical circuit. And one of the great joys to me, as I illustrated in my talk, was that we've already shown in computer simulation that variations of canonical lamina circuit model can give us the most predictive theory and simulation of 3D vision, audition and speech, and cognition. At least when we did it, I can't keep track of everybody. And as I like to say, then it's an existence proof, whether you use our work or someone else's work, but our work, I think, still is the most developed lamina theory, and that's why I call it the paradigm of lamina computing, because you can compute almost everything human or animal intelligence using variations of this circuit. But of course, what is rate limiting? The technology of designing chips. And so Carver was able to introduce a commercial silicon retina inspired by our work, but that, very simplified the most simple aspects of even our retinal models. So the technological challenge of hardware is immense. Now, given that there are uber fast computer networks, they're not going to be very useful for mobile robots. But as a theory, if you look at the corpus of my work as outlined in this, it gives detailed models of all the main processes, auditory and visual perception, cognition, planning, emotion, motor control, that go into that would go into a humanoid robot. It is the blueprint for the design of such an object. But if Google Mind or Google or someone with deep pockets would invest the kind of money in this that they've invested in deep learning, there'd be a revolution, which would be worth, I don't think billions, I think trillions of dollars, because of its unlimited applications, both in intelligent adaptive computing and in the potential for future mobile self-adapting robots. But you need deep pockets to do it. The blueprint is there. That is my great joy in life. I know the blueprint's there. It's in archival journals. Unless the entire internet collapses, anyone who wants to try to do it can, but it's hard. It's at least as hard as this, because we can't grow it through morphogenesis in hardware. And I want to emphasize that. And when you talk about machine consciousness, within our models that we've used to explain many data on multiple levels, some of our models, a single model will explain psychological data, anatomical data, neurophysiological data, biophysical data, and neuropharmacological data. Like this SMART model, it included all those ingredients, so we have a great deal of detailed understanding of how these things work. And then the challenge is to abstract away to find the level that controls behavior. And the earlier models operated on that formal level. And so you can have resonances without worrying about the neuropharmacological aspects. Just put in the minimum anatomy needed to generate as emergent properties the desired function. That's why early in my life, I introduced what I call the method of minimal anatomies. Throw away everything that's not essential to get the so you know what part of each model is needed for a function. And that's embodied in the way I've modeled over the years and the way in which I've unlumped the models to, in a self-consistent way, reveal finer and finer aspects of how they work, including, I never thought I'd live to see the day that I could talk about vigilance control as influencing layer 5 in lamina neocortex via acetylcholine. It was Gail Carpenter and me who first, and also with John Merrill, who was a postdoc. Gail was my closest colleague, who introduced vigilance control in the mid-'80s and early '90s. And that was a formal parameter that we needed to understand how learning could be concrete or abstract. And match tracking was a formal process. But then, starting with Versace and my work, we now could embody it in anatomically, physiologically, biophysically, and biochemically. So that gives you the validation, the assurance that this has been discovered for a foundational reason. It's built into our whole cerebral cortex. And as I remarked in the last part of my talk, you screw around with vigilance control, you can be a very sick baby, very bad diseases, tonic and phasic vigilance control.
Good. So perhaps this is the last question that is related with what is still missing in artificial intelligence, the modern artificial intelligence. Perhaps the question can be shaped into, what is your opinion about generative models of artificial intelligence? Whether you think we are close to getting knowledge based on the true interpretation or understanding of the data and prior knowledge as in humans, or if generative models are simply a probabilistic combination of tokens, let's say, already generated by humans.
Well, sadly, I think, since the earliest days of AI, AI is developed in two parallel and non-interacting streams. And as you mentioned, I think in the introduction, some people call me the father of AI because I introduced the paradigm of nonlinear neural networks to link brain to mind, i.e., to get artificial intelligence in 57. And then I worked with many people so that by the 89, the president of Boston University at that time, John Silber, introduced me to give the annual university lecture at Boston University. And he introduced me in a way that I almost fainted as the Newton and the Einstein of the mind, based on the feedback he was getting from colleagues. And anyone who knows Silber, which you probably never heard of him, knew he was a very tough egg. And that was before I did any of the work on consciousness or a lot of these other things. Or working memory, and so but from the very beginning, there was a sickness in the field because initially, remember, AI, like with Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert, that was symbolic AI. I knew them well because when I was an assistant professor at MIT, Marvin Minsky was a professor in the same department. And Marvin Minsky attacked my work in neural networks while he was doing symbolic AI. And I always try to understand why he bothered. And I think the reason is that Marvin was a very conceited man. He always thought he was the smartest person around. And he had tried to introduce neural networks when he was a young man, and he failed. And that's why he turned to symbolic AI as a way to try to express his thoughts in artificial intelligence. And then he sees me succeeding during neural networks, and I think it drove him crazy. Anyway, in later years, Marvin realized when symbolic AI hit a brick wall that he'd better skedoodle right back to neural networks. And he tried to write a popular book called Society of Mind. But unfortunately, by that point, my colleagues and I had made all the discoveries that he tried to sketch a little on a much deeper level. So his book was a derivative and redundant. Of course, he never cites anyone. But if you're talking about generative AI, like OpenAI, basically their two products have been deep learning and large language models. And as I've written first in 1988 in the journal Neural Networks that I founded about backpropagation, and deep learning uses backprop as its learning engine, backprop and deep learning have 17 foundational problems that prevent it from honestly being used in any life or death situation, like a financial or a medical database prediction problem. Two of the 17 problems are: number one, deep learning is not, it's untrustworthy because it's not explainable. It's just a feed-forward adaptive filter. Let's say it predicts a good outcome and you invest based on it. But then let's say it predicts a bad outcome and you become bankrupt on it. And you go to the person who told you to use deep learning and say, well, why did it make a bad prediction? And they'll say, I don't know, because it's not explainable. So you can't trust it. If it makes a good prediction or a bad prediction, you don't know why. But the second big problem is that it can experience catastrophic forgetting at any time during its very slow offline learning of anything. So it might take hundreds or thousands of slow learning trials. What a slow learning trial is the adaptive weights in deep learning change just a tiny little bit on each learning trial. Otherwise, the thing becomes incredibly unstable and it just crashes and burns. And if you're trying to learn a huge database, well, I should say one reason backprop went out of favor is because people realized that the unexplainability and the catastrophic forgetting were problems other models didn't have. But then when you got huge databases on the internet and uber fast networks of computer servers, you could feed millions and millions of images of cats into your uber fast computers, which now might only take weeks or months until you could put a picture of an image cat in and out come the name cat. And you say, woo-wee, isn't that wonderful? With Carpenter and I had already showed you could get fast learning of a whole database, a non-stationary database, in one learning trial in the 80s. So, you know, you do what you want. And you might say, okay, well, but hasn't it been used for a number of good problems? And my answer to that is that there are a lot of problems that can be solved in a model independent way, meaning any decent learning model can give you a reasonable solution. And if you do the learning with deep learning offline, and each time catastrophic forgetting occurs, you start all over again. But finally, you get it to criterion, freeze the weights, and then it'll be okay. But what if the world is changing and you need to update your knowledge based on the changing world, which is the basic characteristic of our human experience? You have to start all over again. Weeks and weeks of, and the expense, just the amount of electricity they use is causing, social problems. So you get what you pay for, I guess. But I just read a headline today that OpenAI is maybe going to declare bankruptcy because their hype carried them just so far. But what about large language models, the traditional ones? So I'd say don't use deep learning, use adaptive resonance theory or some other reliable model that doesn't experience catastrophic forgetting, or it's one of the few or only ones that I know won't experience catastrophic forgetting in a changing world, and that you can keep learning for lifelong learning. Anyway, what about large language models? Well, you may know that OpenAI, among others, formed their large language model by basically promiscuously scraping the internet of every linguistic phrase, paragraph, article, whatever they could steal without citation or remuneration. So you get a vast corpus of stuff, but because of the way it was formed, it has no values, it has no reasonable learning, and it has no goals. So you hit it with a query, it goes through its mumbo jumbo trying to get a match, and it has a probabilistic algorithm at the output end, tries to give you the best answer among the possibilities there. And if it can't even come close to an answer, it'll make one up and it'll assert it with great confidence. In art, you have a confidence measure which is founded in predictive success. Here, you have confidence founded in predictive failure. So that the bottom line I like to say about LLMs is that they don't know what they're talking about. So how can you really trust them for anything important? Now, you know, if a student wants to use it as an aid and think they can get more bang for their buck than Google, if they know enough to know when it's lying to them, maybe it can help them. But I still use Google. I trust Google because of the community way in which its information is shaped. Now, you might say, oh, okay, it's all very well and good. You can complain and complain. But what do you have to offer? Well, in 2013 on my webpage, there is a paper about how children learn from adults how to learn language and its perceptual and affective meanings. And let me try to find this on my phone because I want to make clear to you something. I'll try to, if I can't find it at a moment, I won't bother you. Okay, here it is, 2023. I'll be there in a minute.
No
Here.
problem.
So it's called How Children Learn to Understand Language Meanings, a neural model of adult-child multimodal interactions in real time. It was published in Frontiers in Psychology. You can download it from my webpage. But what I want to read for you as part of the abstract, this kind of learning often occurs when a child interacts with an adult teacher to learn language meanings about events that they experience together. Multiple types of self-organizing brain processes are involved in learning language meanings, including processes that control conscious visual perception, joint attention, object learning and conscious recognition, cognitive working memory, cognitive planning, emotion, cognitive emotional interactions, volition, and goal-oriented actions. The article shows how all these brain processes interact to enable the learning of language meanings to occur. And then I contrast it with ChatGPT, etc. I call it chat SOME, S-O-M-E, for self-organized meaning. In that, I only modeled how children can learn short language utterances and their meanings. But one thing I want to say, and then I'm going to make the more important comment. Why did it take till 2023 for me to be able to write this paper? Because it took more than 50 years of research. I listed all those processes that go on in a child's mind to make the learning of language and its affective and perceptual meanings possible. I now have an article in Press about how humans learn large language models and their meanings. So I was able to generalize it to arbitrarily large languages. Now, in my paper, did I construct all the languages and all the meanings? No, but I gave a blueprint for how Google Mind, Meta, someone with big pockets could do it. And again, if they succeed, trillion is theirs. But there's a blueprint for learning the most complicated language. It's a start. I'm not claiming I've explained the poems of Robert Frost, but there's an entree that a generation of young people can build on securely, but they have a lot of work to do. Can't do everything in this life. So that'll be published very soon. It was already accepted, and I'll be getting the proofs within a couple of weeks. I'll put it
Okay.
on my webpage as soon as it's published in Frontiers. It's open access. Everything I publish is open access.
Good. Great. I think we got a lot of information to think about, and thank you again for having you. And I think this is the end of this seminar talk.
And thank you so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it. And
Thank
I
you.
hope I didn't chew your ear off. I'm a time-filling organism. Once you get me started, you got to stop me.
Good. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much
very
again.
much. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.